be taking this from an industry perspective. So as you're presenting information to the people that you teach, one of the things that they're going to have to learn to work in is an FDA regulated environment. So we'll be talking a lot about the FDA today. FDA's website is a gold mine for educators and for people in the public, and it's www.fda.gov, G-O-V. And some of the things that we're going to be looking at today, you'll be able to download those to your heart's content and share them with your students. And then regarding the overall structure of the FDA, like any big government organization, FDA has about 10,000 employees. And they have about 3,500 in their field organization. Those are the people that do inspections. So that's mainly what we'll be talking about today. And they have offices all over the country. But in headquarters, FDA is broken down into several centers. So there's a Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. They review drug applications. There's a center and also therapeutic biologics. So CEDAR handles therapeutic biologics, some of the products that come out of Amgen, Genentech, etc. The second part of FDA's headquarters is Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research. That's CBER. And they handle biologic products like vaccines, allergenics. They have another center that's called the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, CDRH, and that group handles medical devices. They have a food group, so they would be involved with some of the products that Janet was talking about, which is a Center for Food Safety and Nutrition. It's a FSAN. Okay? And then they also have a veterinary medicine group, CVM. So it's composed of separate centers. Most of those centers are involved in reviewing applications. When a company is far enough along to be inspected by FDA, then they send out their inspectors from their field offices. Any other questions before we get started? Any questions? Okay, as we go through this too, I'm going to be trying to think in terms of how to present this information to your students. Because in the biotech area, if you're making a therapeutic biologic, it's a highly regulated industry. So there are certain sets of regulations that if you can offer classes inside your universities, that would be great, because typically people have to get their first job before they get that kind of training. So we're talking about things like good manufacturing practices, which are for the production material, and then good laboratory practices. Good laboratory practices is for R&D people who are doing the animal testing. And then there's another set of regulations, good clinical practices, and that has to do with how the clinical trial is run. So, and you can go on FDA's website, you can do these wonderful searches, you can download the regulations to your heart's content, and you can download some of the things that we'll be talking about. So shall we go ahead and get started? Okay. Okay. I think in our industry, usually, even though we haven't yet met, there's probably maybe one or two people that we know in common. So for example, when Janet was talking, I've done inspection preparation training at Fort Dodge Animal Health. It was a lot of fun, helping them get ready for a European Union inspection. So we're going to talk about how do you get people ready for an inspection. And what you want to do is to try to give some people some comfort level about what is going to happen and what they can expect. One of the things when they see an FDA person, they're police officers. They're thoroughly trained in food and drug law. So anytime you're talking to an FDA person, you're talking to a police officer. They're also public health officials, okay? And their primary interest is making sure that patients are safe. So trying to get people to think in terms of what it's going to be like, what's the purpose of the inspection, inspection etiquette. You know, I mean, a soft voice turns away wrath, right? So most people understand that, and so they don't get into fights with FDA. But I tell you, quite frankly, the first job I was in biotechnology, the vice president of regulatory affairs and QA got in a knockdown, drag-out fight with the lead FDA investigator, right? And all the rest of us are just trying to, because we had to work with that person over the next week, okay? So not in your self-interest to, get them angry off the bat, right? Tips on how to get your organization ready, and some do's and don'ts. And some of the things we'll be looking at today are, I brought some warning letters. These are available on FDA's website. When FDA comes out and they do an inspection, if they find problems, one of the things they might do is issue a warning letter. And you can do searches for your region of the country. You can do searches on GMP, GLP, depending on what you're teaching. And then I also brought some 483s. So when they leave, they give a government form. It's called a Form 483, and it details the deficiencies that they saw. So we'll have a chance to look at some of those in this session. Everybody doing okay so far? Okay. The purpose of an inspection, FDA is trying to make sure the organization is complying with the regulations. The regulations have the force of law. So in the United States, the law is the U.S. Code, and the regulations are how that law is interpreted. And basically, if the company has submitted an application, then the inspectors are there to make sure data integrity, they didn't commit fraud, they're ready to make the product. Okay, consequences of failure. We live and work in a goldfish bowl, so everything is public knowledge. I'm sure you've noticed, especially of late, some of the news in our industry makes the headlines pretty quickly. So it can really hurt a company's reputation if they don't do well on an inspection. If it's pre-approval or pre-licensing inspection, before you can get permission to put a new product on the market, you usually have to pass an inspection. So for drug products, it's called a pre-approval inspection. For biologics companies, it's usually called a pre-licensing inspection. And the difference is that for biologics, you have to have a license. Okay, biologics are regulated by the Public Health Service Act, and that requires licenses. So in the serious cases, FDA can pull the license. And when that happens, the organization goes out of business, because without a license, you cannot operate. Okay, so power of regulatory agencies. We're going to be talking mainly about the FDA, but every world nation has their own version, pretty much, of the FDA. Developing nations go through the World Health Organization. They're the ones that have the right to come in and inspect us and make sure that we're following the regulations. They're the ones that we have to go to get permission to market products. So everybody understand, for therapeutic biologics, we're talking about products for cystic fibrosis, medical products. Okay? FDA does not, they inspect food, but they don't, they mainly are interested in food, drugs, cosmetics, biologics, veterinary drugs, those kind of things. Okay? If there's a serious case where they find that the organization is not meeting the requirements, they can pull the license. So a few years ago, there was a horrible case that happened in the state of Utah. And this company was responsible for supplying 80% of the blood for the state of Utah. Okay, but their GMP problems were so severe that FDA worked with other blood suppliers around the nation before they pulled their license. Okay, so they do have the authority to do that, and they would only do a license revocation in the very serious cases. Okay, I wanted to show you some of the things that are going on out there. So this is a summary of some of the problems that they're finding. So for drug companies, these are the problems that they're finding in the GMP area. So you'll see things like the language QC unit. Usually that means we now interpret it as quality assurance. So problems with the quality assurance unit and their procedures. And this one to me is very, very sad, because they're one of the groups inside an organization that is responsible for making sure that they're following the regulations. And as you kind of look through some of the list, you'll see there are a lot for laboratory issues too. Does anybody have any questions so far? Stop me if I'm going too fast or if I'm using acronyms that are, the industry is acronym happy, okay? Biologics. These are some of the problems. A lot of biologics companies don't have their own manufacturing operations, so they'll go through a contract manufacturer. Agencies finding problems in how the company works with the contract manufacturers. Process validation, manufacturing consistency. It's very difficult to make a biologic product. It's a lot harder than making a drug. So trying to make sure that they're consistent. quality oversight in general. So when there is a problem, how well was it investigated? Those kind of things. A drug is a compound that's made by chemical means. So acetaminophen is made in chemical plants that run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and they pump out tons of the active pharmaceutical ingredient. A biologic is made from a living source. So serum, eggs, like vaccines, E. coli, where you're fermenting things, or cell culture, that's a biologic. And then a medical device is a huge range of products. It runs from surgical gloves all the way to implantable and life-sustaining devices like heart valves, pacemakers. So those are some of the basic distinctions. And as you all know, biologics are very, very difficult to make. They're more susceptible to contamination from the source material, and they're more susceptible to contamination during the manufacture. So they're a lot harder. One of the problems we have in biologics as well is sometimes you have single source materials, and that's a big problem, right? Ideally, you'll have multiple sources. If you look at things historically, I mean, biologics have been regulated different ways throughout in our country's history. Biologics were first regulated in 1902 when a horse named Jim was being used to make vaccine at a company in St. Louis. The horse contracted tetanus, and they didn't realize that at the time. And so there were 12 or 13 kids that died from this vaccine because they were injected with tetanus. So biologics started to be regulated in 1902 in this country, and it came up a different path than drugs. Drugs started to be regulated in 1906 after Upton Sinclair published The Jungle, right? And people were horrified at the meat packing industry, and so they kind of they grew up regulated along different acts in our country, and then different places. So biologics, if my memory is correct, at one point it was even like part of NIH. So it came into FDA first, and then recently they've made a transition where they moved therapeutic biologics out of CBER into the drug division. Okay. So right now, CBER handles vaccines, therapeutic allergenics, etc. So I think part of it is a structural, how they decide to handle it. And one of the things that the question was, how do you tell the difference between a drug and a biologic? Every time people come up with a new product, FDA has to decide which center to regulate it out of. And so for combination products that we now have available, it's based on the main mechanism of action. So some of my clients make drug-eluting stents, which is a high-risk device. It's implanted in your body, and it gradually releases drug. Well, on the face of it, you might think, well, it should be regulated as a drug if you've got a drug that's going into cardiac tissue. Not true. It's regulated as a device, and the reason is because the main mechanism of action is the device keeps your arteries open. It props them open. So these are some things that FDA has to decide where they put it and how they regulate it. Okay. Active pharmaceutical ingredient. This is the key ingredient inside the drug or the biologic that causes it to work. So in their FDA inspections, these are some of the problems that they're seeing. And you'll see they're picking up some problems with equipment cleaning and qualification. And then in the laboratory again. Without a specification result is when somebody is doing a test in the lab and they get a result that's outside the spec range, and it's like they have to do an investigation to determine what caused that. Is it a problem with this batch, or what's going on? Was there some sort of contamination? Okay, so those are the API trends. For device, I don't know if we have very many device people here today, but these are some of the problems that they're finding in devices. And then CAPA, again, stands for corrective and preventive action. So once you find a problem, you're required to do an investigation, try to determine the root causes, and put in place things that will fix the problem. And not only fix that problem, but any related problem from happening again. That's CAPA. And then medical device reporting. In this industry, if you pick up a problem with your product, you have to tell FDA, and you have to tell them within a defined time period. So on the drug side, we have to file field alerts within 3 days of knowing you have a problem. Biologics, you have a little bit more leeway. They're called Biologic Product Deviation Reports. Try saying that fast. You've got 45 days to tell FDA. And then on the device side, they file a medical device report. So basically, if you learn that there's a problem with your device or your product, even though you don't know what caused it, you still have to tell FDA rapidly. AdvaMed has 3 wonderful guides on getting ready for an FDA inspection. They're called Points to Consider FDA Inspection, and they cover things like the CAPA system. This is very important. These are hot buttons right now, problems in our industry. So the CAPA system, it's called AdvaMed, so it's www.adv, as in victory, A-M-E-D, advamed.org, and do a search on Points to Consider for an FDA inspection. And there are 3 so far. There's one on the CAPA system. There's one on design controls, which the easiest way I can describe that is in R&D, the concept of having a controlled documentation system while the product's being developed. That you have to have formal documented reviews, have to have an independent person present, those kind of things. That's design controls. And then the third one is management controls. Because in this industry, the buck stops at the top, and there have been court cases to back that. Everybody okay so far? Okay. Yes?
What does CAPA stand for?
Corrective and preventive action. And I've recently written an article on that that was well received. You can also get the AdvaMed guides from our website, which is just the last name. We couldn't think of anything more creative. So it's www.immel.com. And if you go under What's New, and you spool down to the bottom, there are these global regulatory links, and actually it'll take you directly to some of the regulations. And in our resources section, there may be some exercises or skits or things like that that you can use with your in your classes if you'd like. Okay, GLP deficiencies. This isn't intended to be an eye test, but these are some of the problems the FDA is finding in the GLP testing. This is animal toxicology testing. So GLPs have to do with the responsibilities of the study director, the quality assurance group, which is a QA unit. They have to follow protocols to do the research. GLPs talk about the care and handling of the animals. You have to keep the animals separated by species, those kind of things. So advice that I would give is as much as possible to learn about the regulations and to follow them. And you know, that just sounds like basic, but I have seen so many organizations that do not do that. And universities will do this animal toxicology testing as a way to save money. And they are probably the single largest, or not save money, make money. So they allow their people to do their own research in their facilities, but then to make money, oh yeah, we'll contract this out. If you do any contracting out, realize that it takes a tremendous amount of time and energy. You're going to be spending a lot of time with these sponsor companies coming in for audits, lots of questions. It's not just something you can add on easily to make money. And universities are one of the top, they're getting a majority of the FDA warning letters. And some of the ones that I've audited have pretty horrifying conditions. So things like that. And so if it's something that you choose to go into, I would definitely follow the regulations and do it right. The other thing you may not be aware of is that FDA has small business regional representatives in major parts of the country, and they provide free advice. There are 3 or 4 right now. So you can always call them and ask, hey, you know, we're thinking about getting into this. What do we need to know? Okay? And as time permits, they will send somebody out and do an audit of your facility, but you need to be pretty much ready to go before you invite them out. Okay? You don't want them to come out and see anything less than that. Right? Okay. And then on the GCP side, clinical side, these are the problems that FDA is picking up. And GCPs is a set of regulations in the United States, covers the responsibility of the sponsor, who's responsible for conducting the trial, the clinical investigator, the physician that's doing the trial. I just did an audit in Europe of a clinical investigator site. And then the institutional review board, the one that has oversight to make sure that the research is ethical. Okay? And then this is device. So that's enough on trends, right? Okay. Okay, when things go wrong, this is kind of like the list of woes. What can go wrong? Okay, the worst is that a person would be hurt. And everybody I know who's ever worked at a company where there's been a patient injury or death, it haunts them. So I'm thinking about many years ago, I don't know if people heard about the case, there was an infant formula company that took salt, sodium chloride, completely out of the formula. It was a soy formula. And at the same time they did that, the salt content in the plant where it was manufactured outside Chicago dropped. Make a long story short, what happened was babies that were fed with this commercial soy infant formula did not grow at normal rates. They didn't grow at normal rates. And I know someone who worked for the company at the time, and he said it was horrible, Barb. It was just awful. Because remember how we're talking about we live and work in a goldfish bowl? And the other thing is nobody goes into this industry to hurt someone. You know, mainly people are interested in the industry because you have a chance to develop some sort of cure to relieve suffering and pain. But he's an early bird, got to the plant early one morning, steps out of his car, and he's instantly surrounded by the 60 Minutes camera crew filming him on tape. Why are you working for a company that is harming infants? Okay, so it gets into, you know, ethical issues really fast. Okay? As far as I know, it was a mistake or an oversight to take the sodium chloride out. It turns out it's a chloride deficiency that's the problem. Infants need a certain amount of chloride to develop properly. And this was in the late 70s when this happened, and Congress stepped in and passed the Infant Formula Act in 1980, where for the first time they specified nutritional requirements for infant formula. We'd never had them before. Isn't that amazing? Okay, so other things the FDA can do to a company if they're not complying with the regulations. They can do something called refusal to file. So you send them your application, and if you have some GMP problems, they just won't accept it. It's called a refusal to file. Another thing they can do is not take it at all. Okay, that's called application withheld. So no, until you get this GMP stuff cleared up at your plants, we're not taking any more applications. And this is serious for a company because it's their bread and butter. Okay? Other things they can do, application integrity policy. If they suspect fraud, which unfortunately is happening, we just had a huge generic company. Tomorrow in the QC lab workshop, we'll talk about in depth one of the recent fraud cases. A generic company that made heart medications recently shut down completely because of fraud. In their QC lab, analysts were falsifying records. They were changing failing records to passing records. Huge case. It's called Able Labs. Incidentally, as we go through this, I'm not picking on any particular company. This information is in the public domain. Okay. Other things that can happen are a warning letter. If you get a warning letter, you'll lose government contracts if you have them. And you can't ship overseas until you get the warning letter issues cleared up. On that note, let me just go through a few more of these and we'll look at some warning letters. Okay? We've already talked about they'll revoke the licenses. They can do that. Clinical hold. If something happens during a clinical trial, FDA can force the company to put the clinical trial on hold. So a few years ago, everybody remember a very serious case at the University of Pennsylvania. Jesse Gelsinger, who was 18 years old, was enrolled in a gene therapy trial, and Jesse died in the trial. It was a phase 1 safety study, and he died within 4 days of having this compound infused into his body. When that happened, FDA put all gene therapy trials in the United States on hold. Well, they figured out, are we putting patients at risk here, or was this an isolated case? Civil money penalties or fines. This is another new wrinkle. FDA has tried to go through the court system to fine these companies the amount of money they were making while they were breaking the law. So these fines are eye-popping. So some of the recent ones, and again, I'm not picking on any company, but a division of Abbott Laboratories paid $879 million in fines for illegally marketing their products. Schering Plough paid $500 million in fines when they went under consent decree. So this is the new wrinkle. The FDA is trying to hit them in the pocketbook, if nothing else, to get senior management's attention. Whistleblower cases, qui tam lawsuits, and where I see those mainly are on the marketing side. So some of the marketing fines, I don't know, 430 million, etc. Does everybody understand that the whistleblower case a company can bring if they're successful, if their testimony, etc., leads to conviction of the company, they share in the profits from the fine that's assessed. And I think it's high. I think it's maybe like 10%. I will tell you that FDA people have told me that they're having an increase in whistleblowers. And this concerns me a lot, because having an increase in whistleblowers. And it concerns me a lot because it's not good. I mean, you have to check them out. Maybe they're disgruntled or maybe it's not true. But to me, it's a sad state of affairs. It would, to me, indicate that there's a lot of stuff going on there. Exactly. Okay. And then consent decree. Consent decree is the worst thing that can happen to a company in this business. Worst. Well, other than a patient being injured. That's the worst. Okay. But consent decree means that the situation is so bad that FDA will ask the senior executive to go before a federal judge. Federal judge hears the case. It's not a trial by jury. Judge decides. And usually the judge decides in favor of the U.S. government. Company goes under consent decree. If it's a big company and they've got deep pockets, chances are they'll pull out. If they're a tiny little company, probably they won't. They just won't make it. And everything they do is overseen. They have to hire a third-party firm to come in and audit them, to review their batch records, maybe to release their product. FDA tells them what they can continue to make. So this is really an awful situation. So if you have any friends or colleagues that are under consent decree, I hope you're being very nice to them, because it is hell on earth in this business. Under consent decree, FDA will limit what you can make. They will tell you what you can still make. And usually it's something that's medically necessary. So the first company that I worked for that was under consent decree, they made this iron supplement that people have to have after transplants. And the reason FDA allowed them to continue to make it is because their competitor had a worse situation and had had deaths with their product. So FDA has to try to supply the U.S. with the kinds of things they need. So they allowed this company to continue to operate, but that was all they could make. This was a huge case.